Max never believed in the supernatural. At 20 years old, he considered himself too rational, too grounded in reality to give any credence to ghost stories or urban legends. That changed one summer night in his family's old Victorian home. The house itself was unremarkable during daylight hours, a spacious two-story building with worn hardwood floors and creaking staircases. But at night the shadows seemed to deepen in ways that defied explanation. The hall stretched longer, the corners darker, and the familiar sounds of settling wood took on sinister undertones. Max had lived there since his parents bought the place 3 years ago. They were currently away on a business trip, leaving him alone for the first time in the old house. The first few nights passed uneventfully, with Max enjoying his newfound freedom, staying up late playing video games and watching horror movies. An ironic choice, considering what would soon unfold. The neighborhood was quiet, surrounded by tall oak trees that blocked out most of the streetlights. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and a dense forest bordered the backyard. Behind the house, barely visible from the kitchen window, stood an abandoned well that predated the house by at least a century. Max had never paid much attention to local legends, but he vaguely recalled his mother mentioning something about the previous owners leaving suddenly, something about nightmares and whispers in the walls that the real estate agent had laughed off as superstition. Now, alone in the house, those dismissed stories began to surface in his mind. That night, the air felt different, heavier. The usual summer warmth had given way to an unseasonable chill. Max had fallen asleep on the couch watching TV, only to jolt awake at exactly 12:47 a.m. according to the cable box. His mouth was dry, his throat parched. He needed water. As he rose from the couch, the TV flickered briefly, static dancing across the screen before returning to normal. Max ignored it, attributing the glitch to poor reception. He didn't notice how the shadows in the room seemed to pull away from him as he walked, nor the faint whisper that followed his footsteps. The hallway to the kitchen had never seemed so long before. Max shuffled down the hallway, his bare feet making soft padding sounds against the cool hardwood. The house was silent except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. He rubbed his eyes, still groggy from being awakened mid-dream. The kitchen was dark, save for the dim light of the microwave clock. Max didn't bother, turning on the lights. He knew the layout well enough to navigate to the sink. As he reached for a glass from the cabinet, he noticed how unnaturally cold the kitchen felt. His breath formed small clouds in front of his face. "That's weird," he muttered, watching his breath dissipate. The house's air conditioning had never been this effective before. The first strange occurrence happened as he filled his glass with water. The faucet sputtered, then released a burst of brownish liquid before clearing to normal water. Max frowned, emptied the glass, and tried again. The water ran clear this time, but had a faint metallic smell he couldn't place. As he raised the glass to his lips, he heard a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere in the kitchen. It was barely audible, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. Max lowered the glass and listened. The sound stopped. "Hello?" he called out, immediately feeling foolish. He was alone in the house, there was no one to answer. Max took a sip of water, grimacing at the unusual taste. That's when he noticed the window above the sink. Unlike the other windows in the house, this one faced the backyard and the old well. Something about it drew his attention. The glass nearly slipped from his fingers when he saw it. A handprint on the outside of the window, small like a child's, pressed against the glass. It hadn't been there earlier in the day. Max was certain of that. Even more disturbing was the realization that the kitchen window was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could reach it from outside without a ladder. Max set his glass down and moved closer to the window. The handprint seemed to shimmer slightly in the moonlight. As he leaned in to examine it, the handprint suddenly smeared across the glass, as if dragged by an invisible force. Max stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The kitchen lights flickered on by themselves, illuminating the room for a brief second before plunging it back into darkness. In that flash of light, Max caught a glimpse of something reflected in the window, a figure standing behind him. He spun around, but the kitchen was empty. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 1 a.m. precisely. Max felt a chill run down, his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. Something was wrong. The house had never felt this alive before. He decided to head back to his room, abandoning the water glass on the counter. As he turned to leave, the faucet behind him dripped once, twice, then began to run on its own. The water came out black as ink. Max froze in the doorway of the kitchen, watching as the black liquid flowed from the faucet and began to fill the sink. The smell hit him next, not the metallic scent from before, but something rotten and ancient, like soil from a grave. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice sounding small in the darkness. The microwave clock now read 1:03 a.m. Max felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but his curiosity held him in place. He'd always prided himself on his rationality. There had to be a logical explanation for what was happening. Gathering his courage, Max stepped back into the kitchen and reached for the light switch. Nothing happened when he flipped it. The power must have gone out, he reasoned, though the microwave clock still glowed an eerie green. The black liquid had filled the sink and was now spilling over the edges, dripping onto the floor with a sound. That reminded Max of heartbeats. Each drop seemed to echo in the silent house. Then he heard it. A soft humming coming from outside. A woman's voice, singing a melody he didn't recognize. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the well. Against his better judgment, Max found himself drawn back to the window. He wiped away the condensation that had formed on the glass and peered out into the darkness. The full moon cast enough light to see the backyard clearly. The old well, which had always been covered with wooden planks, was now open. A pale mist hovered around it, curling and twisting like living smoke. Max squinted, trying to make out details through the glass. That's when he saw her. A figure stood by the well, draped in what appeared to be tattered black robes. Her back was to the house, her form unnaturally tall and thin. Long matted hair hung down past her waist, swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. Max's breath caught in his throat. The rational part of his mind scrambled for explanations. A trespasser, a homeless person, a prank by neighborhood, kids. But none of those explanations accounted for the dread that washed over him, the primal fear that screamed for him to run. As if sensing his gaze, the figure slowly began to turn. Max dropped to the floor, pressing himself against the cabinets, beneath the sink. The black liquid continued to drip around him, forming small pools on the kitchen tiles. His heart hammered in his chest so loudly, he was certain it could be heard throughout the house. After several agonizing seconds, Max gathered the courage to raise his head, just enough to peek over the edge of the counter. The window was now completely fogged over, but through the condensation he could make out a face pressed against the glass from the outside. A woman's face, but wrong in ways he couldn't immediately process. Her skin was gray and bloated, her eyes sunk in black pits. Her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin that revealed teeth filed to sharp points. Max bit back a scream and dropped back down. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted further, frost forming on the cabinets around him. The humming had stopped, replaced by a sound like nails scraping against the glass. Then, silence. Max remained frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The digital clock on the microwave now read 1:13 a.m. 10 minutes had passed, though it felt like hours. Slowly the scraping sound returned, but it was different now. It was coming from inside the house, from the hallway, moving closer to the kitchen. Max pressed himself harder against the cabinets, his eyes fixed on the kitchen doorway. The darkness in the hall seemed to deepen, to take shape. A long, gnarled hand, fingers too numerous and joints bent at impossible angles, curled. Around the doorframe, Max's entire body trembled as the hand gripped the doorframe. The fingers, there were at least 7 on that single hand, flexed like the legs of a spider, the nails scraping against the wood and leaving deep gouges. The black liquid from the sink had spread across the floor, forming a reflective pool that mirrored the ceiling. In that dark mirror, Max could see movement where there should be none. This isn't real, Max whispered to himself, closing his eyes tightly. This isn't happening, a voice answered, so close it could have been inside his own head. Open your eyes, Max. The voice was feminine but distorted as if spoken underwater. It carried an accent he couldn't place, ancient and foreign. Against every instinct screaming for him to keep them shut, Max opened his eyes. She stood in the doorway. The woman from the window, from the well. In the kitchen light, he could see her clearly now. Her face was a grotesque parody of human features, the skin mottled and stretched tight over protruding bones. Her eyes were pitch black, lacking any white or iris, and seemed to absorb the light around them. The tattered robes he'd seen earlier were actually her hair, impossibly long and moving with a life of its own. "Do you know what I am?" she asked, her lips barely moving but the words clear in Max's mind. Max couldn't speak. His throat had closed up with terror. "The people here once called me a witch," she continued, taking a step into the kitchen. The black liquid parted around her bare feet, which hovered just above the floor. "But I am much older than that word." Max's back pressed against the pipes beneath the sink. There was nowhere left to retreat. "Why?" he managed to croak. "Why are you here?" The witch's mouth stretched into that impossible grin again. "I was here first, child. This house, this land. The well was my home for centuries after they drowned me in it." She drifted closer, the temperature dropping with each inch she advanced. Frost formed on Max's eyelashes and in his hair. "Your family woke me when they removed the seals on the well. 3 summers ago. Do you remember? Your father thought they were just old boards." Max did remember. He'd helped his father clear out the backyard when they first moved in. The well had been covered with wooden planks bearing strange symbols that his father had dismissed as hippie, graffiti. "Please," Max begged, though he wasn't sure what he was pleading for. The witch was directly in front of him now, her face inches from his. Her breath smelled like grave soil and stagnant water. "I've been watching you, Max. Every night, standing at the foot of your bed, waiting for the right moment." Max's mind flooded with sudden realizations. The recurring nightmares he'd been having, the feeling of being watched, the unexplained scratches he'd found on his body in the mornings. "What do you want from me?" he managed to ask. The witch's hand, cold as death, cupped his cheek. "A trade, a body for a body. I've been in that well for 300 years. I want to live again." Her form began to change, her features shifting and flowing like smoke. The black liquid from the floor rose up around them both, surrounding them in a swirling vortex. With a surge of adrenaline, Max shoved her away and scrambled to his feet. He ran for the doorway, but the witch materialized in front of him, blocking his escape. "You cannot run from me in my own domain," she hissed. Max backed away, his mind racing. The well. She was connected to the well. Maybe if he could somehow seal it again. His eyes darted around the kitchen, looking for anything that might help. His gaze fell on the salt container on the counter. An old memory surfaced, his grandmother talking about salt as protection against evil. In one desperate lunge, Max grabbed the container and hurled its contents at the witch. Her scream was inhuman, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The salt sizzled where it touched her, leaving smoking holes in her form. Max seized the opportunity and ran past her, through the hallway and down the stairs. He needed to get to the well, to seal it somehow. The entire house shook with the witch's rage. Pictures fell from walls, furniture toppled, and the air filled with her vengeful screams. Max burst through the back door into the yard, the cool night air a shock after the unnatural cold of the kitchen. The well stood before him, mist still curling from its depths. The sound of the witch's pursuit echoed from the house, a scrabbling, inhuman noise that spurred him forward. He approached the well cautiously, trying to remember the symbols that had been carved into the original boards. His grandfather had been superstitious, had taught him old protective signs when he was young. If he could recreate them somehow. The moonlight dimmed suddenly, as if a cloud had passed over it. Max looked up to see the witch hovering above the house, her form now massive and distorted, her hair whipping around her like tentacles against the night sky. "You cannot escape me," Her voice boomed across the yard, shaking the trees. Max reached the well and looked down into its depths. The water at the bottom wasn't water at all, but the same black liquid that had filled the sink. It bubbled and churned like a living thing. The witch descended toward him, her form shifting and growing with each passing second. Max knew he had seconds at most. In desperation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated, showing the time, 1:33 a.m. He activated the flashlight function and shone it directly into the well. The effect was immediate and unexpected. The black liquid recoiled from the light, hissing and steaming. The witch's descent faltered, her scream changing from rage to pain. Light, Max whispered, a realization dawning. You fear the light. He aimed the phone's flashlight at the approaching witch. Where the beam touched her, her form sizzled and smoked just as it had, with the salt. Max backed away from the well, keeping the light trained on both it and the witch. She circled overhead, unable to approach directly but unwilling to retreat. This changes nothing, she hissed, her voice now coming from all directions. I will. Wait, I am patient. When the light fails, I will take what is mine. Max's phone battery was at 17%. The flashlight wouldn't last much longer. In that moment, a plan formed in his mind. It was risky, perhaps suicidal, but it was his only chance. You want to trade? He called out. Come and get it. He turned and ran back toward the house, the witch's howl of triumph following him. He could feel her presence closing in behind him, cold and ancient and hungry. Max burst through the back door and raced to the kitchen, where the black liquid still covered the floor. His phone battery was down to 12%. He grabbed a knife from the drawer and, without allowing himself to hesitate, cut his palm. Blood welled up from the wound. My blood for binding, he said, remembering his grandfather's words. My will for sealing. He let 3 drops of blood fall into the black liquid on the floor. It hissed and steamed where they touched. The witch appeared in the doorway, her form fluctuating between the tall, skeletal woman and something far less human, her eyes fixed on the blood with naked hunger. Yes, she breathed. Give yourself. To me? Max backed toward the window, still holding his bleeding hand over the black liquid. You said it yourself. A body for a body, but not mine. With his free hand, he aimed the phone's flashlight directly at her face. She shrieked and recoiled, giving him just enough time to flip the latch on the window and push it open. The witch lunged for him, but Max was already moving. He squeezed through the window and dropped to the ground below, his ankle twisting painfully on impact. His phone battery was at 5%. Limping, Max made his way back to the well. Behind him, the witch's rage manifested as a swirling vortex of darkness that boiled out of every window and door of the house. At the well, Max held his bleeding hand over the opening.